Pont-Saint-Esprit was usually just another quiet village in the serene southern part of France. But on August 16, 1951, dozens of residents fell seriously ill. In the following days, hundreds more people also followed them into sickness with complaints of low temperatures, cold sweats, low blood pressure, stomach pain, and nausea. Further complicating things was the fact that everyone suffered from insomnia at night and smelled terrible all the time. The affected citizens were sweating profusely and exhibited a state of giddiness, and the disagreeable odors were reported to smell like dead mice rotting away. Hundreds of the victims had their unexplained mass sickness stop there, but it was just the start for an unlucky few. Dozens of residents started having horrific hallucinations. While the illnesses were well documented, the specific cause of this incident has been debated ever since. The mass poisoning that happened in the summer of 1951 is called la pain maudite in French. Over 250 people suffered during this pandemonium, and 50 of them had to be put into asylums. 7 people died during this incident. Early suspicions about the cause resolved around a foodborne illness, specifically cursed bread. Villagers afflicted with this group madness exhibited strange and unusual behavior that defied explanation. One woman kept crying about how her kids had been ground down into sausages, and a married couple chased each other with sharp knives. A large man smashed his furniture, claiming he was defending himself from horrible beasts, and a small girl shrieked that she was being chased by tigers looking to eat her. One person was caught running down a lane, convinced that bandits with donkey ears were chasing him. A village postal worker got stressed out that he was physically shrinking into a smaller body. Many villagers were running around wildly in an attempt to avoid the flames that they were imagining. Not all the hallucinations experienced were negative ones. Some villagers reported the world being more beautiful, seeing vivid colors, and even hearing choruses from the heavens. The person in charge of the local farmers' co-op started writing poetry, starting hundreds of pages of luminous verse. One of the more intriguing aspects of this mass hysteria was how it didn't restrict itself to the villagers. Even local animals started going mad. Ducks were spotted marching like penguins, and one dog was found chewing on stones to the point of chipping away his teeth. Unfortunately, some of the villagers were also physically hurting themselves. A villager believed that red snakes had started devouring his brain, driving him to jump out of a window. At least one other villager jumped out of a window high enough to break both of his legs on landing, but he got up and kept running. One man became convinced he was trained for circus tightrope walking and tried to cross a suspension bridge on its cables. Another villager dove into the river before being rescued by friends. Once ashore, he claimed to be dead, that his head was made up of copper, and that snakes inside his stomach were burning him. The overall scene was one of mayhem, however. The mayor noted that he'd seen adults of both genders who were previously healthy start ripping up their bedding and hiding under it, trying to escape their hallucinations. Area asylums were filled with villagers wrapped in straitjackets and tied to beds. While the restraints seemed necessary, they also made the victims even more agitated than they already were. Ergot poisoning is the usual explanation for the villagers' suffering, but it's certainly not the only theory. The summer months before the incident happened were wetter than usual, and the rye fields across France saw a lot of growth in the ergot fungi. Investigations after the fact discovered tainted grains and were traced back to the bakery named Rochebriand. A miller used flour contaminated with fungus, and the result might have been widespread poisoning. Ergotism had struck France before in 1816, and it was alternatively known as St. Anthony's Fire. Only some people at the time agreed with this theory. Pierre Jacob was the president of a millers' union in France then, and he rejected the theory in the weeks following the incident. He said that ergot was a constant presence in flour in France, so there's no way it would be responsible for such a sudden outbreak of madness in one community. He even offered to get in front of a panel of experts and eat bread tainted with ergot to prove his claim. Whether or not he followed through with that wasn't recorded. Post-war supply chain issues might have played a part in grain quality. During the Nazi occupation of France, grain supplies were controlled by the government from source fields, through the mills and to the bakeries. Controls were relaxed a bit following the war, but the system was still unequal, as Pont-Saint-Esprit was a location that received lower quality flour than other places. The bakers in this village had no control over the quality of the flour they received. In many cases, they didn't even have access to the provenance saying where it had come from or been milled. Pont-Saint-Esprit might have been hit with the worst incident that summer, but it was far from the only village in the area to have trouble. Several nearby villages had food poisoning incidents in the weeks before the mass madness happened, and their outbreaks were all due to food poisoning from bread. Nearly all the bread flour came from the same mill. In Isarak, more than 20 people wound up having headaches, vomiting, diarrhea, and cutaneous eruptions. Similar symptoms and multiple families getting sick happened in La Motte-d'Oron, Goudargues, and Laval-Saint-Romain. Several customers told the town baker in Connaught that his bread was making them suffer violent diarrhea, and his own family suffered the same thing. When asked, the baker blamed the flour he had gotten, saying it had acid fermentation, resulting in a sticky gray bread. A baker in Saint-Genis-du-Comelas told the mayor that his flour was gray and had worms. The mayor banned bread-making activities with that flour and told local government officials about the situation. They discovered that over 40 bakers in the area complained about flour delivered by the same driver. Pont-Saint-Esprit had 2 doctors in August of 1951, and both their offices started filling on the 16th, the morning after the incident started. Patients came with symptoms common to food poisoning, including heat waves, cold chills, vomiting and nausea. Convulsions and hallucinatory crises soon followed, and the town's situation quickly plummeted into chaos. August 24th was perhaps the worst of it. One man thought he was an airplane and jumped out of a second-story window, plummeting to his death. The same night, an 11-year-old boy attempted strangulation on his mother. One of the doctors called the 24th an apocalyptic night. The doctors investigating what happened were able to pinpoint all the cases of villager madness to a specific bakery, the Briand. Even cases in a neighboring village were traced back to that bakery. Families that ate bread from another bakery didn't fall ill. This was determined on the 19th, while the incident was still in full swing, and the bakery owner was interrogated by local law enforcement on the 20th. As the police investigated, they focused on bread Briand's bakery made on August 16th. There were 3 batches that day, but the second used flour from other local bakers. Interviews with residents yielded inconsistent ratings about that batch. Some villagers said everything tasted normal, but others reported chemical smells resembling bleach or gasoline. A formal investigation started on August 23rd, and it was determined that the tainted bread only had 4 ingredients. They were water, salt, yeast, and flour. 3 of these ingredients were ruled out as a potential source of illness. The water used in making the bread came from a municipal supply that the rest of the village was using without ill effect. The yeast and salt were also supplied to other bakers in the area, and there were no reports of illness or toxicity elsewhere. That only left the flour as the culprit. Tracing the supply chain of the flour led investigators back to 2 millers. One of them was operated by Maurice Mellier, and his mill in Saint-Martin-la-Rivière had already been hit with multiple complaints about his flour's quality. Mellier was interrogated for hours and denied mixing his flour with rye, which is at high risk of ergot damage. He claimed instead to cut his product using 2% bean flour. Experts pointed out how unusual this was because a wheat shortage resulted in a government mandate to mix in rye flour. However, local rye cost more than wheat, so bean flour was sometimes approved as a replacement. In his interrogation, Mellier did admit to making a deal with a baker named Guy Bruyère. Since the season was nearly over, bags of leftover grain sometimes had more rye than usual put into them. Investigators also discovered dust, mites, and weevils in some bags. Mellier didn't want to lose money on low-caliber grain, so he mixed it in with other grain, thinking he could use it all without lowering the overall quality. Mellier and Bruyère were both arrested for involuntary manslaughter and injuries arriving from their trade of improper flour. The poison bread theory was never entirely accepted by everyone, but it was the predominant explanation behind the pandemonium for over half a century. Things changed in 2009 when an investigative journalist from the United States revealed a CIA document. The journalist's name was Hank Albarelli, and he had paperwork suggesting that the spy agency had experimented on the village town people with doses of LSD. Two names appear in the document. One of them was Frank Olson, a scientist for the CIA who was doing agency research into LSD at the time of the village mayhem. The other was David Belin. In 1975, the White House created the Rockefeller Commission to investigate alleged CIA abuses worldwide, and Belin was an executive director of that commission. The document Albarelli found doesn't specify that LSD experiments happened explicitly. Still, it did mention burying potentially compromising documentation that could have linked the CIA with the mass illness in the area at that time. While the dominant theory for decades has been poisoned bread from one of the bakeries, the new LSD theory shared certain similarities. Both theories point to the Rochebriand bakery in the village as the source of the hysteria. Whereas the earlier theory pointed to bread poisoning, Albarelli suggested that LSD was put inside the bread. Biological warfare was a keen topic of interest to many governments in the early 1950s. The world was still recovering from World War II, the conflict in Korea was happening, and the Cold War was in its earliest stage with rising tensions. LSD was a source of experimentation for biological warfare. Albarelli claimed to have found top-secret documentation from 1949 from Englewood Arsenal, an organization that conducted many LSD experiments for the American government. In it, the research director of the organization called for the United States military to do everything they could to conduct field experiments with LSD. Albarelli used the Freedom of Information Act to obtain a CIA report written in 1954. This report contained an agent's conversation with a Swiss Sandoz chemical company representative. The headquarters of the business was only several hundred kilometers away from Pont-Saint-Esprit, and it also happened to be the only known location of LSD production at that time in history. In the report, the agent stated that following several alcoholic beverages, the representative volunteered without prompting that the village pandemonium wasn't from the bread at all. Poison bread and LSD experiments are the only two leading theories into why the villagers suffered from intense hallucinations. Still, other theories also explain what went wrong that summer in the south of France. A few people who have looked into the incident claim that the water used in making the bread was infected instead of the grain. Also, a French researcher theorized that a toxic fungus that happens in grain silos might have been responsible for the crisis, explicitly pointing out Aspergillus fumigatus as the potential mycotoxin culprit. Mercury poisoning was the conclusion of several different investigators. At the time of the incident, fungicides such as panogen were used to treat seeds and grains. Bakeries often returned empty flour bags to the distributor, and several bags from the village bakery at the time showed fluorescent stains on their outside surfaces. At the time, panogen was sold with a red colorant in it. This was intended as a safety measure. The red was meant to tell farmers only to use treated seeds for planting and nothing else. Scientific testing later determined that the coloring wouldn't get into the flour bags, but an active ingredient in it could. Flour contamination would happen because of this, but it would look like it only happened in the bags. Later testing revealed that bread baked with flour contaminated with panogen might not rise in full. Depending on the concentration, contaminated bread might not rise at all. Authorities gave this hypothesis enough credence that it was considered during a French civil trial in the aftermath of the incident. Pre-treating seeds with panogen could lead to mercury poisoning in plants grown from them. A Swedish company made panogen, but it was banned from the entire country of Sweden in 1966. The ban was revised 4 years later and prohibited panogen from all exports, resulting from its withdrawal from the global marketplace. The mass pandemonium ended as quickly and as quietly as it started. Most of the villagers went on with their lives, with their health, but no one had any answers about what happened. Steve Kaplan was a Cornell University bread historian who published a book in 2008 about the Pont-Saint-Esprit pandemonium. In his book, he argued that neither LSD nor ergot could have caused the symptoms, sickness, and hysteria that the villagers suffered. Kaplan ruled out LSD because the symptoms noted in records were similar but not precisely identical to the drug. He also argued against ergot contamination because more than one sack of grain in a single bakery would have been affected, meaning the outbreak would have been much larger in scope and size. Many experts who have studied this episode in history agree that the French government should form an official inquiry into the events of 1951 Pont-Saint-Esprit. Until someone answers the questions convincingly, everyone will continue to debate what happened to the villagers in that mad summer in the south of France.